Error handling and debugging. If I had known this topic sufficiently when I first started, I would have saved myself so much time and pain, and my users would have been much happier. So error handling is the process of your code interacting with an error and continuing in a logical fashion rather than giving your user what's called a debug or a pop-up. And those pop-up warnings are not very helpful for your user. They're going to be error codes like 91 or 9 or application error. So that's not helpful for anybody except for maybe for you if you actually learn what those mean. And then debugging is the concept of learning how to investigate and solve the problems whenever your code is not behaving the way you would expect it to. Let's see how to do that.
All right, we have a data set here that you can download from thatsobasic.com if you go to the Intro to VBA tab and you download the companion file next to the video for error handling and debugging. So what we're looking at here is I've created some sort of fake data for you. None of these are real email addresses that I know of. I just sort of made them up, and some phone numbers that I also made up for you. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a basic loop. And if you go to a previous video, it shows how to do a loop. But what we're trying to review here is if I wanted to say, for example, see that Kat's record here is blank, she's missing her phone number and her email, and I want to be able to identify that and review this specific row without having to slowly go through each loop, but say, run my code until I get to this point and let me take a look. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Go ahead and go to the VBA editor with Alt F11. And sorry, we're looking at a previous module there. Go ahead and insert a new module. If you already have the companion file, then you would be looking at a module. You're welcome to always create a module and follow along in the video as well. Start out with option explicit. And then next we're going to call this sub debug fun. And of course, as always, you're actually looking at the macro as I'm creating it. So save as, if you have created a file, save it as a .xlsm or a .xlsv so that you don't accidentally lose all of your data later. I'll call this debug fun. Okay, so first let's create a loop. We're going to declare our last row of data, dim lrow as long, and that's going to say if we want to count the account names here in column A, and we're assuming here that we have entries here, and I don't ever want to interact with my header, so every time that I count a row, I'm going to say, well, don't let my row be less than 2. 2 is the minimum number that my last row can be because I don't want to ever go up here. So let's also give sample macro this worksheet. Let's refer to it as a WS as worksheet. And I'm just giving a short name to what I'm going to refer to the worksheet so it's easier to type and interact with it. So I don't have to always type out which worksheet name. I can just type out WS and say that's the worksheet that I'm interacting with. So we'll type lrow equals cells rows.count column A .end xlup.row. If you don't remember how to count a row, then this is in the finding the last row of my data lecture. But this cell reference here it's a little bit implicit. It's saying, you know, refer to whichever cell happens to be active and or the sheet that happens to be active. So sheet 2, if I have sheet 2 up, then I've not told it which sheet on which I'm counting the last row of data. And so I always want to be explicit about that. And by doing so, I can type sheets sample macro dot cells. And like I said, that can get kind of redundant. So if I wanted to do it like this, I can say set ws equals sheets sample macro. And now I only have to type these 2 letters every time I want to refer to that specific sheet. Now also keep in mind that it gets kind of redundant to repeatedly type out WS, WS, WS. And if I'm going to consistently refer to this worksheet, then I can use a with statement. So let's type with, oops, with what? WS. I always type the end with right away because I don't want to forget to do it. Tab this over because we're now indenting because we're inside of another statement. And now every time that I refer to the dot here, that's going to say link up with the most recent with statement that was referenced. And so right here, if I didn't include the dot, it's just whichever sheet is active. If I do include the dot, then it's going to link up here. Okay, now moving on. We're almost there to the debugging portion. I'm just kind of constructing the data so you can see a real live example of what kind of information we're going to be working with here. My L row can never be less than 2. So we're going to say if L row is less than 2, then L row equals 2. And then next, we're going to create a loop. So I need to make an integer that's going to increase with each row. So the integer is going to start at 2 and it's going to end at my last row. The integer is merely representative of the row itself. And so I as long is my variable type. It's just a positive or negative whole number. In this case, we're only working with positive numbers because I'm not going to talk about a negative row in any context. So for I equals 2 to L row, and I'm going to put next I. Now I'm going to say if dot range, and so again, I'm typing the dot, which means that I'm going to link up with the 2 letters up here, WS, which is the worksheet on which I'm interested in looking at data. And so if dot range, and we're going to type the letter of the column that we're interested in looking at. Maybe it's that this is an empty record. If B or C are empty, then we're going to put a result in column D that says missing data. And so we'll type B, we'll type an ampersand, and what this is doing is concatenating 2 strings together to make 1 string. And so by typing the letter I here, I'm creating B2, starts at 2, and then it's going to become B3, B4, B5, B6, and it's going to keep doing that until it gets to B16, evaluates that row, and then exits the loop. And so we're going to evaluate the contents of B2 first. And so dot range B and I equals BB null string. You can evaluate if it equals 0. You can evaluate if it equals a blank string. It really depends on, like, if you know that this is a string, then you can go with a string. Since it has dashes in it, it's definitely a string. This is obviously a string. It's got lots of different kinds of characters. If it's just a number, then you're welcome to go with 0. We're also going to evaluate if, well, we're going to use the OR operator because we're trying to say if any of my data is missing, either the phone number or the email. Well, we're going to say dot range C and I equals BB null string. Then, and only then, am I going to put an output into column D and state to the user that there's missing information. Okay, and don't forget to put an endif. If you forget, you will get a lovely compile error. So it says next without for. And this is a great example of how Visual Basic is not always super intuitive. So what's happening here in the next without for is that it's first saying that this and this do not link up. And so it's thinking, well, next I, but you're inside of an if statement, so that doesn't make sense. And so the reality here is that this cannot link up with this statement if you don't close off this statement. It's trying to link things up from the bottom. And so if I put the endif, I will not get that issue anymore. And the same thing happens. If I was to close this off, then it's going to try and link this up with this, and it's going to say end with without with. And so it's trying to link up an end with here to the for and saying, well, that does not make sense. I'm expecting a with statement, and I got a for statement. So here, put it back so that it says next I. And that's one of the first debugging tips that you really want to be cautious of is whenever you're getting that mistake, it means not necessarily that there's something wrong with your end with. It means that there's something wrong with the first linking statement as you move your way up, that the closing out of the upper statement is probably missing. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so couple things that we can do here. I can put a stop break into an if statement and hit play. And what just happened is it ran through the loop a bunch of times until I became 13. If you're struggling with this concept of how I got to be 13, please go back to my loops video and rewatch it. That should help you understand it. And so now we're at I equals 13, and we've gotten to the point where these conditions were met and we're kind of evaluating, reviewing this set of data. But what if randomly I wanted to say, I don't really care a whole lot about the if statement. I just want to see what happens when I get to the record that says Patrick. And so in that case, I would want to use a completely different set of tools. And luckily, Visual Basic does create these sort of debugging tools. If you go to debug, it's a menu up at the top, and you click on add watch. What this does is it gives you the ability to watch different variables and data as it's flowing through your module. And so, as you know, these variables are taking on different values. So I is becoming 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I don't really have a lot of variables that I can watch here, so I'm going to go ahead and create some. And if I type out name equals dot range A and I, and then let's also say that phone equals dot range B and I. And then lastly, we're going to type out email equals dot range C and I. Okay, so something kind of cool about this is if you were reading this later, this is not intuitive at all. If I didn't have any of these variables and I saw that there was an issue here, I don't know what's in column B, C, and D. So if I was to put here phone, put here email, and then put here, well, there's really no need for me to put anything here because it's pretty obvious I'm talking about the result. But if you wanted to put a comment, you could just put result. But I don't need to assign a variable here because I'm just dumping straight into the sheet. So since I have created email and phone and name, I need to create variables, declare the variables here. And so first we're going to type name as string and then phone as string. I'm going to wrap text, which I use with a space and then an underscore, hit enter, and then we'll type email as string. All right, so next we're going to watch and sort of view what is the contents of these three variables as we loop through this loop. Go back to debug and then click on add watch, and we're going to put name, and we'll just, for now, before we explain all of these options, we'll just put watch expression. And then we'll go here and then type add watch, phone, debug, add watch, email. Okay, so now if I was to just hit F8, I'm not hitting play. I'm just going to run through one line at a time, so I'm repeatedly hitting F8. And then I get into the loop, and I first have name, phone, and email. So if I look down here, I can see where I'm at in this loop, what are the contents of these variables. Now, perhaps I don't want to just like watch the loop like this. Like obviously these variables are changing and that's super exciting. But what if I just want to skip right ahead to the part where it says Patrick? Then I can go ahead and I can either right click and edit the watch and then change my settings here, or I could have changed the settings when I was creating the watch. But I'm going to change name. So right click on name and then click edit watch. And we're going to click on break when value is true. And we'll type name equals and then in quotes Patrick. And remember the quotes are important because that would be a text string. So then click OK. And we'll hit play. And as soon as the name variable assumes the value Patrick, the code stops and lets you review where it's at, and then you have to decide if you want to continue playing by hitting F8 or by hitting play. You can have multiple watches all within one statement. So you could say when name is equal to cat and email equals VB null string. So if we add another watch, let's go in here, debug, add watch. We'll put name equals cat and email equals VB null string. And we'll then say break when value is true. So if you'll notice the expression that we just created down here at the bottom, instead of having the eyeglasses symbol, it now has the hand with a blue kind of piece of paper in front of it. And that's indicating that you have a stop point, or it's going to break when a value is met or a condition is true. And so here, I'm just going to go ahead and hit play. And once name has become cat and email has become Tina, email has become VB null string, at that point it stops. And then I could hover over what, the variable I has and see that we're in row 13. And then I could go back here and see row 13 here. And so then I'm going to end up with missing info. I have it there from where I ran it earlier, but that basically just generates there. So a couple other things to consider is if I wanted to, say, take the name and then I edit this watch, I have the option to just break every time that the value changes, in which case every time that the name changes, so basically every time I start a new loop, it's going to break. So then now the name is Matthew, I hit play, now the name is Thor, I hit play and it's Anna, and so on, and it just keeps doing that until it gets to the end of the loop. If I don't want to individually set a lot of watches, as you can see, there's some flexibility here in that I can evaluate multiple logical statements and I can handle whether, when and how often it breaks. But what if I just want to see the variables themselves and the contents without explicitly creating each statement here? So if I hit F8, it compiles and immediately picks up all of the variable names that I have here. None of them have values or assignments yet, but as soon as the worksheet object gets assigned, a plus sign showed up there. You can rewind the video if you want to see that happen. And so whenever there's a plus sign, that means that this is an object variable and that it has lots of components. So it's got methods, it's got properties, parameters, and it's a doozy to look through all of this information. So I don't recommend using the locals window to look at objects. I think that's a great way to just get lost and tumble down the rabbit hole. I do think it's great for looking at data type variables. So if you hit F8, you can see all of these are getting assigned here, and I can very quickly and easily see the contents of any of the data type variables. So just remember, go to the view menu and then go down to locals and you can see this menu. You could also get to the watch window from this menu. The watch window exists both in the debug here, where you can add a watch or edit a watch, and then here you can create the watch window. So this view here is driving what windows I have visible to the user. And so if I close this and I close this, my watch did not go away. My watch is still active. The only difference is I don't see the window. And so here I can go click on watch window and I bring it back. Here I can go and I can click on locals window and bring it back. It's not docked right now, so it's on top of my other code, which can be a little bit of a nuisance. So obviously if you have multiple screens, you can see how that can benefit you. So go to the view tab one more time, the view menu, and then go down to the immediate window. I love the immediate window. I think it's great because it allows me to basically ask a question. And so if you'll recall, I said that objects are not easy to interact with in the locals window. It's hard to find the information that I want. So what if I wanted the name of the object that we've called WS, which happens to represent a worksheet here? So I'm going to type a question mark and then ws.name. If I hit enter, it then tells me the name of the worksheet. If I say, what's the name of my workbook? Then I can get debugfun.xlsm. And then I can do all kinds of things. Like I can ask what's the name of the variable name, or what's the string assigned to it, what's the phone number, what's the email. I can get all this information from my immediate window. I can also resize this so that I can see more information here and less of my code. And now you'll see we're going to interact with the workbook. So in addition to be able to ask a question of the immediate window, you're also able to carry out simple actions. So if I was to type out ws.range d and I, where I is the iterating variable that represents our current row, and it currently contains 3, As you can see, you can hover over the variable while you're in the immediate window, same as you can do within the module, and see what it contains. And then we're going to set it equal to the string test. Now, instead of hitting F8 to run, I'm simply going to put my cursor at the end and then click enter. It doesn't look like anything happened, but if I was to actually go to the workbook and view it, you can see that test was now dropped into the cell D3. If we go back to our editor, let's go over a couple other options of debugging. Well, really, we're going to go over error handling. What I just went over are a lot of debugging windows that are going to help you figure out what's going on in your code and interact with the code without rewriting the code itself. And next, what do we do if the user encounters an error? So here in between my if statement, let's say that I have some code, and you have some problem code here. And here in my third line of this problem code, an error pops up. Now, I've evaluated this error and said, when this error occurs, I don't want the user to be notified, I'm fine with the results, and I'm going to go ahead and tell the next line of code to execute and just move on. So in order to set this up, I'm going to type on error, resume next, and then after the if statement, I'm going to type on error, go to 0. And it's best practice to run your code through several test cases of what you think your data might look like. So if you've got perfect data, try seeing what happens if you delete different elements. Perhaps you want to run some code at the beginning that doesn't run any subsequent code if there are missing elements. So you have to decide ahead of time what errors are you going to allow to occur or check for ahead of time. But in the case where you're allowing an error to pop up, you should decide in advance whether you want the user to be notified and to have the code suddenly stop, or whether the code should continue. So in this case, my code will just continue to the next line, and when I get to on error go to 0, that setting will be turned off. So everything that occurs after on error go to 0 will again start to notify the user of errors. Now, the reason why I want to turn it off, and this is very important, is that there is an error handling cache that will get full over time. Eventually, your workbook will crash if you have the error handling turned on and you're just running all of your code with resume next. Eventually, it could get too many errors and then just crash entirely. So, that being said, on error go to 0 is a must-have to turn it back off. I can also use the go-to statement to indicate a specific place in my code to execute as the next line in the case that an error occurs. So instead of automatically going to the next line in order, it's going to go to a line anywhere else in my code. It can be above where I'm at, or it can be below where I'm at, as I indicate. So let's say on error go to single word, next point single word, and then after the end of type next point, and then a colon. It automatically indents to the left, and now whenever I encounter the error here in this line, it's going to go directly to next point. And if I want to turn that off, I would then again type on error go to 0. And what happens, if I forget to type on error go to 0, if I was to, say, encounter another error down here, it would incidentally bring me back up to next point, and I would sort of get stuck in an infinite loop if the on error go to 0 was not activated. Because if this wasn't here, I would get to the problem code here, go back up to next point, get to the problem code, go back up to next point, and on and on and on. So don't forget to put on error go to 0. And I'll leave you with a last point that I think is really important, which is don't ever put the go to inside of an if statement and then have your point that is being executed next be outside of the if statement. Or say if you're in a loop, don't exit out of the loop prematurely using a go-to. This is a bad logical flow and can cause problems, and eventually your program could crash if you're not correctly exiting out of indented statements. So do your error handling within a statement, allow the end if to occur naturally, and the same goes for your loop. So if you keep these tips in mind, you should be able to prevent your program from crashing and also investigate all of the issues that are happening very thoroughly using the watch window, the immediate window, and the locals window. Now again, I will upload this file to thatsobasic.com on the Intro to VBA tab and next to the link that has the video for error handling and debugging. Thanks for joining.